Since making the microwave stand, I've wanted to make a wooden box for the recycling to go in the recycling drawer that's in the microwave stand. I'm going to start by making the handles. That will help in picking the box up out of the drawer. So I have some pieces of maple left over from various projects. They're all not big enough to really do a project with, but are perfect for something like this, where I don't need a whole lot of material. But I didn't need it this thick, so I can resaw this piece of maple in half. I've seen David Picciuto on his channel has shown a method of resawing where you don't use a fence, so I thought I'd try that, and it worked pretty well. And I can rejoint that cut face and plane the whole piece to get it to an even thickness all the way across. Now, in building the hold down table and showing the video last week, one of the most common comments was to try using a plastic sheet or paper or some kind of sheet material to block the holes that aren't under the piece of material that's being held down on the CNC machine. So I thought I would try that. And it seems to work pretty well. So I cut out the plastic under the piece I want to hold. And looking at this now, I'm realizing it's like the 3-year-old cutting out the piece of birthday cake right from the middle of the cake. Like maybe I should have done this at the edge. But it worked just fine like this. Now I can cut out the 4 handles. So the handle is going to be a hole in the side of the box, and what these are is a surround around that hole to make the material a little bit thicker, so there's more to hold on to. I'm thinking the sides will be a fairly thin material, like 1/4-inch plywood. The one problem with the plastic is you end up with the plastic that you used, and I would either need to fold this up and store it somewhere and try and use it again, or I have a bunch of plastic to throw out, which isn't so good. And I didn't quite go deep enough on my cuts, so I cut out the pieces on the bandsaw. It was sort of like the CNC cut was just a guide for doing some woodworking. So I sanded off that cut edge. And I'm going to glue this piece to the piece of plywood that'll make up the sides. I need it really smooth. And I got out the old shaper, which I haven't used in a while. It's a little dusty. So I want to round over the outside edge of all of these. Now that the handles are ready, I can start making the sides. And I actually have a leftover piece of 1/4-inch birch plywood, which is going to be almost exactly the right size to make the 4 sides of the box and the bottom. Now for these pieces, I wanted to be able to put them onto the CNC in the same spot. So I used my pieces of wood to block up the holes of the hold down table, but to also give me a reference spot for each side panel on the box. Now, one of the conceptual ideas, or one of the design ideas for the box, was to take some inspiration from the paper bag that we had been using for the recycling. So I had noticed the very top of a paper bag has a little bit of a serrated cut, if you look at it really closely. So I thought I'd make that pattern on the top of the box. It would match the design language of the handle on the drawer as well. So I cut a little curvy top to each side of the box. And I can pull that out. Then the next piece can go in exactly the same spot really quickly. And I just have to turn on the vacuum again and it's held in place. There was a little bit of sawdust to clean up between each panel. And I can cut the next one. Now the sides are ready for the handles to be attached. So I wanted them all down the same amount from the top and centered on each side. So I can mark the centers, and then I can use a long straight edge to get them all at the same height along each side. Then it's just a matter of gluing them on. And I just found weights around the shop to hold them in place. When I first glued them down, I held them by hand for about 30 seconds or so, just so that they'd be less likely to slide around under the weights. So I let those dry overnight. I can take all the weights off, and they're ready for the next cut. And what I can do is cut out the hole in the handle. And doing it this way, I can cut out both the cut in the handle and in the panel at the same time. And it made a little crown. It looks like it could be a logo for something. And I cleaned up the handle a little bit. Then I wanted to round over the inside of the handle on both sides. Sort of so wherever you touch the box, it'll be rounded over and sort of softened, so the feel of it will be comfortable. And where you don't tend to touch the box, it'll be sharp and sort of crisp at the corners. Turn it over and do the other side. You could do this with the CNC, but it's almost easier to just put a bit with a guide bearing on the shaper or on the router table and just cut it that way. Now for the construction of the box, because I'm using fairly thin material for the sides, I wanted to add some material at the corners and the bottom. So I'd have something to connect and hold the box together. So I cut out some strips of 3/4 inch plywood. And instead of building a frame and then attaching the side panels to that, I attached the pieces of the frame to the side panels and then attached the whole thing together. So I could glue the strips onto the panels somewhat roughly. They didn't have to be real precise. They just had to look about right. Then once everything's glued, I can trim the panels down and put it together just like it was a thick piece of plywood. And not worry so much about trying to make a structure or a frame perfectly and then make the panels fit that frame perfectly. So once the glue has set up, I can cut off the sides and make a miter for the corners. And this will give me a really clean, very sharp edge on the outside of the box, which I think will look a little bit like a fold on a paper bag. I think one of the big methodologies in woodworking is to think about it as though you're always adding something and then cutting off some part of it, and then adding and then cutting off, and adding and cutting off. Instead of cutting up a bunch of pieces and then trying to glue them together perfectly, you sort of add a few pieces, you cut off a little bit, you add a few more pieces, you cut off a little bit, and in doing it that way, you sort of sneak up on perfection, or at least something that looks perfect. I needed a dado on the bottom to hold the bottom in place. I didn't want to see the bottom on the outside. I wanted the sides to come all the way down the side so that there wouldn't be a base that it sits on. So in doing this, I can hide the bottom panel inside the box. Then I'll do the corners with biscuits. I thought about doing a spline, which would also work, but how I had angled the tops of these strips would make it difficult to have that spline work out nicely at the tops of the strips. So I just did biscuits. And I dry fit everything. Then I can glue all the biscuits in place. So I did half first. I did basically one panel with the two sides, let that set up, then took off the opposite panel and glued that panel up, so that I wouldn't be gluing up all four sides at once. That's a lot of gluing to try and do before the first gluing starts to set up. Then I can cut the bottom out and just put that in place with some glue and I held it in place with some pin nails. I thought about putting a few screws in, but this isn't really going to ever hold a lot of weight, so it should be okay. And some polyurethane finish. And it looks like a little castle. So there's the old bag coming out. And the first time I put it in, which was before this, it wasn't quite fitting, and I was in a little bit of a panic because it wasn't quite going to fit. But the drawer actually moved out a little bit more. And it's a little tight, but it just fits in place. And it rides on the handles on the sides of the drawer, which I didn't even realize or think about. That wasn't part of the design. It actually works where it holds the box about a 1/16 of an inch above the bottom of the drawer. So it actually makes it seem like the handles were meant to do that. Thanks for watching.